Welcome guys to part 2 of the week 3 Twitch chess ladder recap. 8 games today, some really good ones, so pay attention. This is up and comer against Seek. It was a King's Indian, played properly, believe it or not. So this was a main line. This is the main line, Castle 96. D5, 97. This is classical, 91, 97, 93, F5. Okay. So the whole idea is that in this position, well, let me go forward one more move, F3, F4. So white has this big pawn chain this way, black has this big pawn chain this way. So black is going to try to mate white's king, and white's going to try to mate black's c7 pawn. So you might think that sounds a little weird, but usually white gets his attack in faster than black, and white has more defensive resources than black does. But it's very double-edged, obviously, and, you know, it's play for both sides. But, you know, black's trying to get in g5, g4, and white's trying to get in, like, b4, c5. This isn't so popular at the highest level anymore. Usually white will play some other system other than this, either like a bayonet, which is 9 b4, or even like a Makaganov, early h3, bishop g5 Petrosian, maybe even a samish with f3, something like that. But in any case, usually this has not been played too often at the top level in recent years, because it seems like black gets actually good results. Okay, so bishop d2 was played. And now, usually, black does something kingside based here, either g5 or h5. Because ideally, black wants to play g4 and try to either rip open this g file or maybe get a pawn on g3. And then if white ever plays h3, black can try to sacrifice on h3. Eventually, he can try to get a knight to g5 and then try to sacrifice on h3. And there's all sorts of motifs relating to this, but in general, you don't want to move anything on the queen side, because if you move pawns on the queen side, it kind of helps white with his momentum of opening lines. Because white, for his part, is going to be playing moves like rook c1, knight b5, b4, c5, and again, trying to mate c7. So when black plays a5 here, it seems like, okay, it's kind of a natural reaction to stop b4. But the problem is you're not actually really stopping b4, because I can always just play a3 with b4 to follow, and opening this a file doesn't help you, because again, you're opening up lines on the queen side, which white is going to have full control over. And by opening up the a file, now this queen gets access to the queen side, and c5 is not really deterred at all. So you always have to be careful about pushing pawns on the side of the board where your opponent's trying to play, because opening up lines on that side of the board usually not a good idea. So a5 is a mistake. Rook c1, whoops. So yeah, rook c1 is natural. And also b6, again, like you're only going to be temporarily stopping c5. So b6 is probably not great either. a3, so now he kind of goes back to the king side, g5, b4, and now, funnily enough, now that you've actually played a5 and b6, probably what black should do here is play a move like c6. And it looks weird, but the idea is that if white ever takes here, black can take on c6 and get an outpost on d4 for his knight, which is quite powerful. And if he doesn't take on c6, say he plays c5 immediately, well then after take, and take, this is actually kind of equal, because even though white's opening up the queen side, he doesn't really have anything much to show for it. You know, say after take, eventually, if this exchange happens, I can post up a knight on d6 and get good pressure. I'll play like a pawn c4, bishop a6, that type of thing. Or if you take, then again, I mean, I'm getting a knight to d4. And even if I have to sacrifice a pawn, you know, it's not the end of the world. Because actually black's up a pawn here, so it's not even sacrificing a pawn. So it kind of chips at white's big pawn chain, and it discourages a move like c5, which is what white wants to try to do. Because now he has to worry about, you know, some sort of like captures on d5 and even e4, sacrificing a pawn but getting a square on e5 for his knight. But he kind of continued with his natural plan of knight to g6. But the problem is now that c5 is strong. c5, rook f7. And now the problem is the c file is opening by force. The queen side is kind of white's domain. This pawn on d6 is weak. this knight's hopping into b5, potentially c7, and then maybe even to e6. And black really hasn't even started his kingside play yet because he took time to play these moves. So he's down a couple of tempi from where he should be. I mean, normally it should be like already like this or something. Okay, so funnily enough in this position, if you ask a computer what you should do, a computer suggests something that is completely outlandish and that no human would ever play. But the computer really likes c6, knight f6, b5, say something like, I don't know, h5, and a4. This is what the computer likes. So, I mean, any human can tell you that locking up this entire queenside is completely antithetical to what white wants to do. White wants to open up lines because that's where his advantage is, that's where his space advantage is. So even though he has tremendous amount of space with this huge phalanx of pawns, the problem is he can't ever do anything about it. There's no real sacrifices on these pawns that really work ever. You know, even if he can get his knight to c4 and his bishop to a3, I mean, he can always defend this pawn on d6 adequately. And now black just has free reign to kind of mate white at his lead, get his queen out, play g4, he can take, play bishop h3, get his rooks over. I mean, he has time to do whatever he wants. But the computer really likes this idea of having space. But obviously this is not correct. And so what white did makes a lot more sense. C takes d6, c takes d6. So now knight b5, forking d6 and c7. So black played knight f6 to cover c7. Rook c6 is a strong move, attacking d6. Bishop f8 defending it. And now queen c2, another good move. So bishop d7, hitting the rook, but unfortunately allowing knight takes d6. And bishop b7, actually, you don't even have to move this rook, believe it or not, because this pawn on c6 is going to be super strong. Of course, you could play a move like rook c7, but I think actually stronger is to just play like rook c1. And the idea is that, you know, with this pawn on c6, you can play like bishop e1, bishop f2, and go after this pawn on b6 even. You're going to be able to play c7 by force. This knight on b5 is unassailable. And black's position is kind of collapsing. So you actually see that an exchange sacrifice comes into play in a few moves. He played bishop d7, knight d6. So yeah, if bishop c6, just knight f7 wins. Because king takes f7, pawn takes, and this pawn is way too strong. And you're not even down any material. It's just up a pawn. So he took with the bishop, and then rook takes. Okay, so now, you know, white's won the pawn. This pawn on d5 is passed. Everything looks really good. Black here played rook to c8, which looks natural, but is actually not a good move. The problem with it is that he needs to at least try to win some material for his troubles, because if he's just down a pawn, this is hopeless, because this pawn is super strong. So he needs to try something like queen b8, with the idea that the rook is trapped, but this is actually still very good for white. Just rook c6, again, the idea is that after bishop takes c6, we can actually take with the queen, believe it or not, rather than the pawn here. And then after knight e8, just go rook b1, threaten this move, with an attack on b6. Then after, say, queen d8, take, knight c5. And this is actually quite strong for white still. Because now this pawn still being on d5 means that we have this e6 square under control, so we can play knight e6. This rook's coming in to b7 even. The bishops are coming in. I can play d6 at some point, maybe. You always have to worry about this a5 pawn. Knight b7 to knight d6 even, potentially, depending on where this knight goes. All sorts of shenanigans. But yeah, all of black's pieces are kind of misplaced, and white is doing really well here. But okay, I mean, it's better than what happened in the game, which is rook c8. Because now, if white simply just attacks b2, or sorry, e5 with queen b2, it's pretty much over. So for example, queen c7, again trying the same idea of trapping this rook, but now it's worse because rook takes f6. Rook takes f6, rook c1 just to get this queen off the file. Queen somewhere, rook takes, check. Bishop takes, and bishop c3. And this pawn is falling. And the problem is once this pawn falls, these pawns start pushing really quick. And these two bishops are monsters. You know, this bishop can relocate to b3. And now e5 and d6 is coming. So this is pretty much hopeless. This rook is really misplaced. And this bishop, even though it's technically white's or black's good bishop, is, you know, this pawn chain really limits its scope. So, I mean, white's just completely winning there. So queen b2 makes more sense just to attack this pawn. He played queen to b3 instead. Whoops, not bishop c3. He played queen to b3. Which doesn't make as much sense because he's not attacking this pawn, and it has actually kind of less scope in a way. Okay, so again, queen c7 is probably what black should play, winning material, because again, this rook is trapped. Rook f6, rook f6, rook c1. Same idea as before, except the queen's not on b2 anymore. Queen d6, rook c8, bishop c8.
Check.
Take, 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 and bishop a6. Okay, and now white does actually have 2 pawns for the exchange, these two. But now e5 isn't falling. So, I mean, even though white's better here, I mean, black maybe still has some chances. But I mean, black has to try to win some material for the fact that his position is very bad. He instead played 98. And now, again, he's trying to win material, but the problem is e5 is falling. So the rook is still trapped, but now after rook takes g6,
check.
h takes g6, knight takes e5. Now again, we have these 2 connected passers. And this is very bad for black. So rook f6. And now, I mean, he played knight takes e7, which is fine, but, I mean, you know, it doesn't really seem like a great idea to give up this really powerful knight for this bishop on d7. So maybe just like queen b2. Then say after take, take, king h7, bishop a6. This rook really is nowhere great to go. Rook c7, and just bishop d3. So the idea of playing bishop a6 is to kind of like gain a half a tempo, so that you can play bishop d3, and then you just kind of want to move this knight someplace and play e5 and d6 and have massive amounts of pressure. So this would have been really good. He took on d7, which is also pretty good. But again, having the queen on d3 is a little awkward. You'll see why this actually comes into play later. Okay, so queen takes e7 forced, e5, just establishing this great duo. Rook f5. Okay. So now this pawn's attacked. So the best way to deal with this is to just play d6 check, force a king move, and then to play bishop c3. And then to play bishop c3. And now if a4, just queen to b2. Knight g7 trying to blockade. Bishop d4 trying to win a third pawn. Bishop d3. And just queen e2 and now attacking this pawn. And now rook b8, now rook c1. So white is just constantly making threats. So first we're attacking the b pawn, then we're attacking the rook, and now we finally get a rook to the c file. And now rook c7 is coming, queen e4 is coming. You know, queen trade is actually going to be quite good for white. So even though he's down the exchange, this is very good for white. Actually completely winning. But a blunder was made. Instead of d6 check, he played bishop to c3. And the problem is, in this position, that all of a sudden his queen becomes overworked. Because now that he's played e5, this pawn is only defended by the queen. But the queen is also defending this guy. So after the strong move a4, all of a sudden this queen is losing some coordination with his pieces. Because now the queen has to stay on c3, but now d5 falls. So queen b2, queen takes d5, and now the pride and joy of white's position, these 2 pawns, suddenly doesn't look so strong. Okay, I mean, white's actually, believe it or not, still better. But he's given up a large portion of his advantage by giving up that pawn on d5. So, so rook d1, okay, gaining a tempo makes sense. But probably even better was to play bishop d4 just to kind of remove the threat to the bishop and attack b6. And then so after a move like b5, now to play rook d1. And then say like knight g7, queen b1, and if king h7, bishop b2, queen b7, bishop d3, attacking the rook, but also notice the rook can't really move because of this check. So queen b6,
check.
King h1, rook f7, so queen b6, the idea is to defend against that. But after bishop d4, trick, he can't take because of check. Queen e6, and now, or sorry, queen e6. And now bishop takes b5. And again, white's kind of better because this pawn may be falling and this pawn is kind of quick. He played rook d1 first. So the problem with rook d1 first is that allows this strong move queen to b3, which is kind of a fork. It forks the bishop and it forks the queen. And a queen trade actually really helps black out. So the point of bishop d4 is now queen b3. You can actually just avoid the queen trade. Because if queen takes a3, the queen gets way too passive, so that you can just go like queen d2 or something. But after rook d1, queen b3 was a good move. Very good move, actually. So now take is kind of forced to take. And now bishop d4. Okay. So here black's just up the exchange for what, a pawn? Exchange for a pawn. So here black needs to activate his rook probably with rook f7. And then just try to, hit this pawn and then get his rook to 7th rank maybe with rook c2. Instead he played b2. So the idea was he was trying to create a trick where if bishop takes b2, rook c2 is a fork, forking the two bishops. But the problem with b2 is that there's no reason to, kind of make this pawn undefended. Like, if force white to try to win this pawn. Because after b2, actually just king f1 is strong. And the point is, you can't stop bishop takes b2. So for example, if rook c2 here, just bishop to d3. And then if rook c1, just actually king to e2. And now you can't stop you losing the pawn. So b2 kind of accelerated the loss of that pawn when it was kind of unnecessary. So he kind of played for a trick, but king f1 was just a cool splash of water on black's face. Unfortunately, he didn't play king f1, and he took on b2, which of course was a mistake because rook c2 just forks. And after bishop d3, rook takes b2, bishop takes f5, g takes f5, black's just up a piece now because it was 2 pieces per rook. So this is technically won. So I could end the game here, but there's something I need to show you that's very important. So let me fast forward another 7 moves. So this is a loss for white. And black showed some good technique up until a certain point, which I'll show you in a second. So h4, gh4, king h2, king f7, rook d8, rook b3, rook b8, rook a3, rook b6, rook e3, king h3, rook e5, king h4. Okay. So black's still completely winning. He just needs to kind of make sure he holds on to these pawns. And so the way to do that is to play the move knight to g7. So the idea of knight to g7 is that we want to put this knight on e6 and put our king on f6. And that way these pawns are permanently defended. So for example, king g5, just knight e6.
Check.
Now the king has to go someplace that it doesn't really want to go, either h5 or h4. And no matter either one, you just play king f6, and then eventually you just bring the rook behind this pawn, bring the king to e5, and eventually you win. If white could somehow remove both of these pawns from the board and get some sort of rook versus rook and knight position, it's a draw. But the problem is, if you ever play, say, g3, for example, take. The problem is these pawns are on the same file. So I can always win this pawn by force eventually, this f3 pawn. And there's no way to exchange these pawns. So that's what he should have done, knight g7. But instead he played rook e6, which is a blunder of all blunders, believe it or not. Because now this actually is a draw. This position's a draw. And the way to draw here is simply to take the rook. And believe it or not, black can't do anything to progress in the position. Simply play b5. Okay, so now if your knight tries to blockade this, so if your king runs to the pawn, I'll just win these pawns, and it'll be a draw. I'll win at least one, and then I can trade off for the other one. So for example, king d5, king g5, if you try to defend this pawn, I'll take this one, and then if you try to take this one, I'll just play g4. And this is a draw, obviously. You have no pawns left. If you try to defend this pawn with a king, and then keep the knight on this pawn, so for example, say king f6, b6, knight d6, so trying to blockade this pawn with the knight and try to use this king to go through this pawn. The problem is I just play king h5. And now after knight b7, I play king h6. and you really have nothing you can do. If you go king anywhere, king e6, king e5 doesn't really matter. Play king g5. Sorry, king g5. And now you're kind of in zugzwang. If you move your king, I'll take your pawn and win again. If you move your knight, I'll just move my king. And again, where's your king going to go? If you go to, say, d4, I'll just take on f5. And if you go here, I'll just go here. And again, I'm just going to play g3 and remove your last pawn. You can't go king f2 because I can take on f4. Your knight still has to babysit this pawn. So all you can really do is just move your knight back and forth. So you move knight c5, you go king h5, knight b7, king h6, it's just a draw. Nothing you can do. So that rook play is actually a draw, believe it or not. So for all the up-and-comer endgames he's been studying, he forgot the simple king and pawn endgame was just a draw, because this knight and this pawn are basically cancel each other out. The knight can stop the pawn, but black can't do anything constructive. To his everlasting regret, he played rook to b8 and then lost the game subsequently in another 25 moves. But rook e6 could have cost black a chance at a win, but it didn't. And then I'll just show you guys a really funny position at the very end. I'm not really going to play the moves, but I'll just show you guys a really funny position that occurred at the end of the game that you have to be wary of. So it was this position. So it was here. And it was black to move here. Okay, so black played rook g1. And white took.
Check.
And now, of course, if black takes with the pawn and makes a queen, it's stalemate. So black correctly played this move. And then white resigned. So it was a cute little stalemate trap at the end, but black ended up winning. Okay, so that was kind of a crazy game. Let's look at one a little less crazy, which was the game between Neo and Daru. Okay, so this game actually had a predecessor, so you guys should watch all these videos, because if you did, you would know that bishop g5, which is what Neo made as a mistake. And if you guys want a reference game for this, check out Zwish against Hakov, where actually almost the exact same thing had happened. Zwish had played knight c3, and then bishop g5, which is also not accurate. So bishop g5 in this Slav is not what you want to do early on. Again, you want to kind of just develop your king side. So you can play queen c2, e3, knight c3, whatever. Any of those are reasonable, but bishop g5 is not really super accurate. Because black has two good responses here, either d takes c4 or knight to e4. D takes c4 just kind of trying to hold on to a pawn, and knight e4 just hitting the bishop. He played knight bd7, which kind of made it transpose back to a main line after knight c3 and e6. So here, white should play either e3 or c takes d5. In these semi-Slav type structures, you usually don't want your bishop on this diagonal, and white played g3 in this position. So again, either cd5 or e3 makes sense. But with this pawn triangle, this bishop on g2 doesn't really feel particularly happy. And also now d takes c4 actually gains some venom, because now your bishop isn't defending this. So bishop g2. And here, another common theme that arises in these games is that black played bishop d6, which is a mistake, because this bishop belongs on e7. One is to unpin this knight. Two is that this bishop is not really doing much on d6. It's hitting on g3, which isn't really that great. And three is you're liable to this e4, e5 idea. And this bishop and knight are not well placed. So this actually comes up in another game later on. But yeah, it looks like bishop d6 is more active, but bishop e7 is definitely the superior square. Okay, so bishop d6 was played, and now white kind of tries to exploit that with e4, but unfortunately this is actually a bit premature, because white hasn't castled yet, and black actually has a strong reply here. And this goes in general. I think we actually saw this in another game. I believe it was Fianchetto against Romeo, where Fianchetto played this early e4, and the correct response to this is to play an immediate e5. And the problem now is that this knight just feels a bit silly, and black gets good play for his pieces. He gets good squares for his pieces. Because now this pawn is eventually going to get exchanged, so black's going to gain c5 for either his knight or his bishop. And furthermore, this bishop gets to get out now, because we get to play e5. So, for example, d e5, knight e5, knight e5, bishop e5, queen d8,
check,
king d8, castle, check, and king c7. And black's actually just fine here. Black's up a pawn. His king is relatively safe on c7. He's just going to play bishop e6 and rook d8, etc. But instead he played bishop e7, so, okay, you see how he kind of admitted his mistake. He played bishop d6, bishop e7, so part of the reason why it belonged on e7 to begin with. E5, knight d5, bishop e7, queen e7. Okay. So now white has to try to win back his pawn, right? Whoops, not that pawn. The pawn on c4. So the way to do that is to simply attack it. Well, what's the best way to attack it? The best way to attack it is actually to play knight to d2. Simply trying to get to c4 and t6. And so black should probably play like knight 7 to b6. But here white can play knight c to e4. And white's actually, believe it or not, probably slightly better. Because this knight's coming to d6. And at the very least I can win my pawn back. And if black tries something like b5 to defend the pawn, well, now I have a4. And notice you can't play a6 because I can take, and this is pinned. Common Queen's Gambit tactic. So you have to play something like b4. But again, I play knight e4 with this idea of knight d6, I'm hitting this pawn. But what white shouldn't have done is what he did, which is take on d5, because now, after c takes d5, now, first of all, you improve black's pawn structure, but second of all, now this pawn is just a free extra pawn. So he should have used this e4 square for his knight to come to d6 rather than taking on e4, because now, not only have we treated in, not only are you down a pawn, but now you can't even get a knight to d6 anymore, because this pawn defends e4. So knight takes d5 is like a very bad positional move. Not to mention that you're just remaining down a pawn. But after knight d2, white's actually slightly better. Okay, so now there's only one last thing I want to show in this game, because it was kind of cleanly played from both sides toward the end. So castle, castle, b3, b5 was good. bc, queen d2. So there was one just cute tactic I wanted to show you that happened at the end. So white's kind of trying to stack up, but doesn't really lead to anything. b7, bishop f1, b8, queen a6. Okay, so black actually has a win here. Oh, sorry, instead of queen c7. So black actually has a win here, and it revolves around the fact that this rook is kind of overworked. So the way to win here is simply by playing c3. So the point is I'm kind of forking two things. I'm forking the knight, and I'm threatening the rook. But then the rook has two responsibilities. It has to defend this rook, and it also has to defend queening. So after c3, for example, if knight f3, I can play c2. And now I'm threatening two things. I'm threatening this, and I'm also threatening this. So if you move your rook to b2 or b3, I queen. If you move your rook along the first rank, I take your rook. So this just wins. So after c3, actually, white's best move was to play something like, I don't know, rook d1 or something, or sorry, rook 4 b3, and then just give up this knight. And then now black's just up a piece. He actually played queen c7 and won after a few more moves. a4, knight c8, rook b7, rook b7, rook b7, queen b7, queen a5, and queen b6. And here, white resigned because he's losing probably a third pawn eventually. Probably has to take, and then take with a knight, and then a5 forced probably knight a4, and at the very least like c3 and c2 is coming real quick. And at the very least, I mean, I can kind of just bring my king over. So white resigned. Okay, so that was that game. Okay, next game is TRX against Mr. Pants. So this one again had a predecessor that they should have learned from. And this predecessor was the game Marius against Mimstar. So knight f3 and Mimstar in this game played bishop f5, which is again a mistake. And as Marius demonstrated, the correct way to punish this is play cd5, cd5, and queen b3 with this tactic that I showed before. So again, instead of bishop f5, the moves are either e6, d takes c4, or a6. So Mr. Pan should consult that game. And any of you guys who play this system, well, hopefully after seeing it twice and seeing the mistake happen twice, you guys will know better. But TRX didn't play the cd5, which is the most accurate, and played e6, or e3 instead. e6. Okay, so here, now this bishop is kind of shut out, white usually takes this opportunity to win the two bishops here with knight h4. And then the idea is after bishop g6, take, and bishop d2. So this is, oops, bishop d2, sorry. This is the more usual way to play. And here white has the two bishops, but black has no real weaknesses and an open h file that he can use for his rook. That's kind of the more standard way to play. Bishop e2 was played, just kind of trying to develop. And now that white has eschewed knight h4, black usually plays h6. Oops, h6 here. The point is to give the bishop h7. So now on knight h4, he can play bishop h7. And then black's just going to complete his development. Bishop e7, castle, etc. But instead, black played c5, which is not a good move. Really need to just complete your development. Now, the reason why this is not great is after cd5, knight d5, castle on knight d6, knight c6, you're kind of opening the center when you're at least 2 moves from castling. Whereas white's already, kind of castled completely. So bishop d2, cd4, knight d4, knight d4, e d4. So isolated queen pawn. But again, black's real problem is this king. So black probably has to play a6 here. The point being that on queen a4 check, you have b5 available. And if white wants to sacrifice, this is actually probably okay for black. King e7, because if bishop g5, I can play f6.
Check.
And the king is actually relatively safe. I can go to f7, and your queen's hanging. But instead, black kind of played a natural move, bishop e7. But the problem is here now, white has a strong move. Queen a4 check. And you can't interpose, obviously, because I win your queen. So you'd have to play king f8. And after king f8, I play knight d5, e d5, and rook a e1. Whoops, sorry. I resized that by mistake. And rook a e1. And the problem here is that this king is no longer able to castle, and this rook is out of play. So white kind of has a free hand to pressure down the e-file. And this is good. You can't even really play g6 because I can play bishop h6 check and force your king to really be in a corner. So queen a4 would have been a nice move to force king f8. And bishop e5 would also be good too to force king f8. But queen a4 is actually stronger because after queen a4, notice that I get to connect my rooks. So I get to play rook a e1. Whereas if I play bishop e5 check, I have to play like rook e1. And the reason why rook a1 is important because maybe I want to play f4 and g4 and stuff. And just try to rip open the f file. And then I'd want my rook on f1. So it's a slight nuance, but in any case, he didn't do either of those things after bishop e7. He just played rook e1. So, it's a natural looking enough move to play on the e file, but the problem is, again, he had something much stronger. So you need to take your opportunities when they present themselves, especially against an uncastled king. If you can force a king to remain uncastled, it's generally a good thing, especially if you don't have to sacrifice anything. But after castling now, unfortunately, this is just equal. Okay, so bishop f3. So his point is he's actually threatening to win a pawn here, guys. Believe it or not. He's threatening to play knight takes d5, e takes d5, and bishop takes d5. And if queen takes d5, rook takes e7. And if queen takes d4, rook takes b7. So just to show you that, if h6, take, so so now I'm threatening this. So if you take, I take. If you take here, I take here. I'm defending this. So you could go rook d8, I guess. Maybe this works actually. So yeah, maybe you can take on d4, but maybe bishop c3 is good. And then
check.
Take. I have a rook on the 7th. So okay, at the very least, he's kind of threatening those types of ideas. Maybe it doesn't quite work, but rook c8 was played. So instead, he probably should play knight b4, heading for these squares. Bishop b7, knight c2, bishop a8, queen a8, d5, queen. It's just a sample line. d6, fe6, rook e2, knight a1, queen a1, and bishop e6. Okay, so black's down a pawn here, and he has a weak pawn on e6. But black has two strong bishops. This queen's out misplaced. This rook is good. This queen is good. White's pieces are kind of jumbled. So this is probably about equal, believe it or not. So that's one way I could have played, but he didn't play knight b4, he instead played rook c8. And so now he went for this knight d5, e5, and now he played queen b3, which is good. No rush to take on d5. Because now he's also hitting b7. So queen b3 was a good move. Bishop f6, hitting d4. And now you have to realize that, you know, neither of these pawns are going anywhere, so it's probably better to defend your own pawn first, with simply bishop to c3. And this way you win a pawn. Now if bishop e6, you can take on b7, and now not only does bishop c3 defend this pawn, but it also defends b2. So if rook b8 or something, you can just take on rook b8, just take on a7, because this pawn's defended. So bishop c3 probably just wins a pawn, because you can't defend both of these. But instead he kind of went for bishop takes d5, now bishop takes d4, bishop b4 hitting the rook, so if the rook moves, bishop takes f7, so bishop c5 is forced. Take, rook d1. Okay. So here, we need to be careful, because there is a big threat here, actually. Say the queen goes to, I don't know, say the queen goes to g5, for example. Well, now white actually has bishop takes f7.
Check.
And if rook takes f7, this is actually mate.
Checkmate.
So you have to go king h8. So in this position, black probably should try to keep an eye on this pawn on f7, but also his pawn on b7. So he wants to get off of this file, but the way to do that is play queen to c7. And now he's on both these pawns. So for example, if queen takes b7, queen takes, bishop takes, you can play rook to b5 and fork these two guys. And this is probably just equal. But instead he played queen f6, and now queen b7 wins a pawn, bishop e6, bishop e6, fe6, threatening queen takes f2. Queen takes f2. So probably slightly more accurate to play rook e2 here, as opposed to f3, which is what was played. The idea of rook e2 is that you defend this pawn, but you also are getting ready to either double on the d file or double on the e file, depending on, you know, what happens. But it gives you a little bit more flexibility. f3 was okay too. Rook c2, a little annoying. Queen b3 hitting these two guys. And now, black can kind of go for this slightly inferior endgame with queen takes b2, queen takes e6 check, king h8, queen g4, defending g2, queen takes a2. And it's actually even pawns, but white's probably slightly better just because his rooks are a little better. I mean, the queen and the rook on the 7th are kind of strong, but this rook is a little weak. And also black will have more back rank issues than white. But this is probably objectively drawn. But unfortunately, black missed the main idea of queen b3, which was that it attacks the rook. And he forgot that queens move sideways, or backwards even. And he played rook e8 to defend the pawn. But queen takes e2, and then he got mated. So don't forget, queens move backwards, guys. It's an important rule to remember. Okay, so that's that one. Okay, now this one was super interesting. This was Music Dan against Higgs. So unfortunately Higgs had to drop from the ladder He couldn't invest the time necessary. But he played a very strong game in this game. Even though he lost on time due to a disconnection, he actually was completely winning in the final position. And he would have certainly moved up the ladder if he had stayed. Okay, so this is some sort of I don't even know what you call this. Catalan, I guess. This is a Catalan. So the most natural moves here are bishop to g2 or knight to f3. Queen c2 is already kind of an inaccuracy. And the reason is because of c5. This is actually a very strong move. So the point is, if d takes c5, well, I'm going to develop my bishop with tempo. And knight f3, knight c6, black's already better. This queen is already misplaced. And if you play cd5, I'll play cd4, de6, bishop e6, and already black is better because this queen is misplaced, this pawn's really strong. And black has better development. Black has 2 pieces developed, white has 0, really. I mean, this queen doesn't really count. So queen c2, c5 is an excellent response. Knight f3, cd4, knight d4, e5. Okay, black is already much better. And so white should probably respond just knight f3. Then d4. You can't take on e5, of course, because queen a5 check.
Check.
Typical tactic. So d4 indirectly defends this pawn. And then bishop g2 and knight c6, and again, black is doing pretty well. But white plays knight to b3, which is a further mistake. Because now after knight c6, this queen isn't feeling too happy. And so white has to try to complete his development with bishop g2. And now this forced line, knight b4, queen d1, bishop f5, threatening knight c2, knight a3 forced, dc4, queen d8 forced,
check,
rook d8, knight a5, kind of forced, b5 just defending this pawn, and you can't take on b5 because of knight c2 fork. So knight c6, knight takes c6, bishop takes c6,
check,
bishop d7, bishop takes d7,
check,
rook takes d7, knight takes b5, bishop b4, check, king f1. And after this long line, black's much better because black's up a pawn. I mean, sorry, because white can't castle, and black is massively in development. So black can kind of go like king e7, rook d8, etc. So that's kind of the least of the evils, but white actually just blundered horribly here and played a3, which just loses on the spot, believe it or not. Just loses on the spot. And the way to win is simply just take on c4. And the problem is that after take on c4, okay, well, if you move your knight, knight d2, say, knight d4, queen takes c4, bishop f5 just wins. Because you can't really stop knight c2. And you can't stop rook c8 and rook takes c1 mate. So this is just game. And if you take on c4, which seems the more natural move, well, I just play bishop e6 and you can't defend your knight. You can't defend your knight. Because no matter where you go, if you go to a4 or c2, I have a fork, queen d5. And that's just the game. So black could have just won the game on move 8. But instead chose to play d4. Still a large edge though. Now white probably should play bishop g5, get this bishop out before putting this knight on d2. He instead played knight 1 d2 right away, but now this bishop is kind of stuck. There's no reason to really rush knight to d2, so you could play bishop g5 first, and if h6, probably even take here, and at least try to get some light square control on e4. But he played knight 1 d2 instead, and now bishop e6 would have been good. Oh no, sorry, I missed a move. Sorry, he played bishop d2 first. Or wait. Oh, sorry, he played bishop e7. Sorry, I missed the move. He played bishop e7, bishop g2, and then again here dc4 is just stronger. d4, and again here he should play bishop g5 instead of knight d2. He played knight d2, and here bishop e6, castle and a5 is really strong. Because this knight actually has nowhere to go. because this knight is kind of boxing it in. At least if this bishop were on g5, he'd have c1 and d3 to go to. So he probably plays something like a4 or something ridiculous, and then knight b4 is really strong. But instead he played g6, castle, bishop f5, queen d1. So probably even here knight e4, just to try to trade some pieces off, because when you have less space, trading pieces off is a good idea. Knight e4, bishop e4, queen e4, queen b6, and okay, white's maybe only slightly worse. Go like knight d2, knight f3 or something. But okay, queen d1, and again a5, trying to exploit the really awkward position of this knight and this knight. And then again, if a4, knight b4 is really strong. So a5, and if knight f3, trying to get this knight to d2. Well, now the problem is I can play a4, and then e4. Well, maybe even castle first, and then e4. And these pawns are monstrous. All of a sudden, I'm going to play e3, d3. I'm going to play knight h2 or knight e1. It just looks really bad for white. Okay, but he castles instead. Knight f3 or d8. Knight bd2, queen d7. So again here, e4, knight g5, e3, fe3, de3, queen d1, rook d1, bishop c2. You have to move your rook someplace. Rook f1, say. Bishop d3. Bishop takes e3. So white's actually up a pawn here. But the problem is, well, temporarily. But after bishop takes c4, the problem is this is misplaced, this is misplaced, this is misplaced. These rooks are bad. I'm going to be playing rook d8, moving this bishop away to some sort of discovery on e3 and e2. e2 is hanging. This is really good for black. So pushing those pawns kind of just leads to a good game. He played queen d7 instead, a little more positional. Rook e1, again a5, a4, maybe like with knight a5, knight b3 to follow. But he played rook a d8. So here, white has to try to stop e4 at all costs by playing knight to g5 with the idea of knight to e4. Played b3, which is a mistake, because now e4 is really strong. And then after some moves, we get this position. And now white's in real trouble. Stronger than knight e5, by the way, would have been g5, believe it or not. It looks strange, but the idea is simply to keep pieces out of f4. And then, for example, after bishop e2, now to play knight e5. And this is really good. But he played knight e5 first, after which white should have responded with bishop f4, just trying to evict this knight. And if bishop f6, just take it. And then queen c1 and just try to survive this. Maybe try to trade some more pieces. So then f1 stops mates on h2. But instead, after knight e5, he played bishop e2. Bishop f6, f3, d3 was very strong. And now white has to play bishop takes e5, bishop takes e5, and rook a2. But this is kind of really bad after knight f6. He instead played king h1. And now black to move and win. Really a variety of ways to win here. The best way is probably d2, actually, believe it or not. So, okay, the rook is trapped, so you have to take pretty much. And now I take on g3.
Check.
King g1 forced. So the point of d2 is to deflect the knight. And now e takes f3. E takes f3, and rook takes d2 is completely crushing. Because now if queen takes d2, knight takes f3 wins every piece you own. And if you don't take, I'm threatening mate, and it's just really bad. So that would have been kind of crushing. So after d2, probably relatively best is to play f4. And then again, knight takes g3.
Check.
Knight takes g3. Knight g4, threatening mate. So you have to go knight f1, knight f2 check, forking all the pieces, king g1. Knight takes d1, rook e takes d1, bishop takes b2. Okay, I'm just up, what, a queen for a knight. And this pawn is still on the board. So this is just over. And then just in the final position, instead of d2, he played d takes e2, which is still completely winning. Because after queen takes e2, he can just play e takes f3, forking these. And it's a win, but he got disconnected. black, and so he lost on time, but of course he's completely winning. But he had to leave ladder anyway. So kind of a tour de force from Higgs. Really strong game. He could have even won more quickly, but White just made a couple of really careless opening moves. Queen c2 was a mistake, knight b3 was a mistake, and then a3 was just a blunder. So he just wasn't, I guess, familiar with the ideas in these types of positions. But yeah, in the cat line, you just want to develop your kingside pieces. You just want to play knight g2, knight f3, bishop g2. It's very hard for black to hold on to this pawn on c4, because you often get like knight f3, knight e5 ideas. You can get quick e4, and even if you have to sacrifice a pawn on c4, and it's often good because you get open line on the c file to develop your pieces. So that was kind of a bit of a mismatch. Okay, so now let's look at the game of the week, which was the matchup for championship between the Llama Lord and GPAC. Okay, so these guys played a lot of theory. d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3. It was a BOGO.
Check.
So knight b2 is kind of most accurate. a3, bishop e7, e4, g5, e5, knight f7. Okay, b4. Okay. So White's just kind of expanding on the queen side without developing his pieces. Black kind of just has a very compact structure. So after b4, Black should probably play a5, just immediately chip away at this pawn structure. And then after b5, play c5. And then if cd5, ed5, bishop d3, cd4, knight b3, a4, this is just a position. It's a theoretical line. And if bishop b2, then just c takes d4. And again, it's just a position. This b pawn kind of makes this knight awkward, but like this pawn's a little weak, and maybe this knight can come here and this knight can come here. Okay, but he played this move b6, which is an inaccuracy, because now after c takes d5, e takes d5, bishop d3, c5, he has a little bit more weakness than he would normally. Castle. And now knight a6 is probably better, with the idea that queen c2, h6, rook d1 is slightly better for White. If pawn takes pawn, always there's like queen c6 ideas and queen takes d5. So this pawn is never really in danger of moving. He played knight c6 instead. And the problem with knight c6 is that this knight's undefended. So now queen c2 again. Now this pawn is actually legitimately pinned. h6, bishop b2, knight d4, knight d4, cd4, bishop d4, a5, and e6 is strong. e6 is strong. The point is, if you take on e6, of course, I'm going to play queen c6 and fork these guys. And the two bishops are menacing, and black is kind of very cramped. But Llama instead, after knight c6, played bishop e5. And now it's just equal. Bishop e7, defending the knight, bc5. This is all relatively fine. This is still fine. Yeah, this is kind of still fine. So now black has his isolated pawn, but his pieces are starting to get more active. Knight d4, bishop a4, queen e2. Okay, so now it makes sense just to kind of play queen d7, connect the rooks, and then if knight f3, just play knight e4. And, getting a rook to c8, getting a rook to b8. Well, black is perfectly fine here. This isolated pawn is not so weak because it's hard for White to attack it. His knights aren't really in good position to attack this pawn. His bishop's on the wrong color. And this knight is strong on e4. This bishop is good on a4. Black has two bishops. There's no problems for black here. He played bishop d7 instead, which is a little odd. I don't know why the bishop was doing important stuff on a4. It was controlling d1, controlling c2, blockading a3. In some positions, White might want to play a4, bishop a3. So the bishop was good on a4. I don't know why he played bishop d7. Knight f5 wasn't really an issue. And queen d7 was what he should have played anyway, so... okay, so here Llama should probably play queen f3, attack the pawn. Knight e6. It's actually awkward for black to defend this pawn. He doesn't really want to play bishop e6 because of like knight c6 potentially. So probably best is to play something like knight e6. Queen takes d5, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, bishop e5 hitting the rook, queen d8, bishop d8, rook d1, bishop a4, rook f1, bishop e5, and just perpetual. You don't really want to go rook e1 because bishop a5 is strong, and now this knight's pinned forever and this bishop is stuck. So that's why I have to go rook d1. And white's down a pawn, or sorry, white's up a pawn, but black just has a perpetual. So queen f3 would have probably just been equal. Instead he plays f4. Aggressive. But now e4 is a permanent home for the knight, eventually. Knight e6 was also reasonable. Knight 2f3, bishop c5, pinning the knight, unpinning the knight. Okay. And now black can do a couple of things here. Black can play rook c8. Just get a rook on the open file. Black can also play queen a5, just connecting the rooks. But there's no real rush to initiate this exchange because you know, you kind of want white to take this knight, right? Like say queen a5. I mean, you kind of want this to happen because now this pawn is weak. Rook takes f4 is threatened. You know, this bishop's going to b5. This is actually good for black. But black kind of made this exchange, which only helps white out really. He should take that tempo to develop one of his major pieces. So knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, bishop e7. He wants to avoid the trade of bishops because this is technically, you know, white's bad bishop. Queen e3. And again here, I'm not sure why he didn't either go queen a5 or rook c8. Either one is fine. But he played bishop b5 instead. Rook c1, queen e7, bishop c5, rook f c8, take, knight d4. So this is kind of like a good knight versus bad bishop scenario now. Knight f5, queen d7, knight d6. Yeah, so all of a sudden this knight is getting real hoppy. And here, simply rook c7 is probably better than rook c6, which is what black played. And the reasoning is you just defend the b7 square. Because after rook c6, white should play rook a b1. When guess what black's best move is? Well, it's rook c7. So wasting a full tempo in this type of position is not what you want to do. So rook c7 is better. Rook c6, queen d4 was played though. And now probably something like queen c7. The idea of queen c7 is that so you can initiate a trade on b8 if white plays rook b1. So rook b1, rook b8. Trading your bad rook for white's good rook. Rook takes b8,
check.
Takes b8. a4, queen c7. And okay, I mean white is probably better because of this knight on d6, but it's hard for white to actually make significant progress. Black will eventually play something like g6 or something. Maybe even h6 and just create some loot for his king. But, you know, if white ever plays rook b1, maybe he can just play rook b6. Okay, but instead he played rook takes d6, which was... Oh, sorry. All the way back here. Rook takes d6, which is not great. Because the problem is after take, you can't even take on f4, or sorry, take on d6, because rook takes c4, and there's a pin. So after take, he had to play, to try something, he had to try rook c8. He had to try rook c8. And here white can just play rook b1. And notice you can't play queen takes d6 still. Okay, it looks like you can, right, at first glance, because after rook takes c4, rook takes c4, this is defended. But you actually can't, because after rook takes c4, white to move and win, queen takes d5, tricks on tricks. So this is actually a deflection and a fork. So if queen takes d5, rook b8 is mate. And if the queen moves anywhere, I'll just take on c4. And even if the queen is somehow defending c4, if you take on c4, I have rook b8 mate. So this wins a rook. You'd have to play like queen f8 or something. So this still doesn't work, so you still can take on d6, but what you could do is play h6. Okay, now you're threatening to take on d6. And then rook c3, nothing really better. Queen takes d6, rook g3, and g6. Okay, and white's still doing quite well because he's up the exchange, but at the very least, you get to win that d6 pawn, that pesky d6 pawn. But there's still some tactics involved. But instead, after rook e8, this is a big mistake. Because now rook e1. And so you lose a full tempo, because you don't really want to trade rooks. So you probably have to go rook c8 again, but I mean now it's just a worse version of, you know, of what it could have been. You know, maybe just rook e7 and rook e1 or something. Okay, but instead he took...
Check.
Now he can't take because of winning the queen, so he plays h6, but now I get to keep this pawn for good. Queen e5, and black resigns because this is hopeless. So, powerful game from Lama Lord. GPAC could have played better in some instances, but he was definitely equal around, say, here. Maybe even slightly better. But yeah, if he just kind of develops his pieces naturally rather than making all these awkward moves, probably would have ended up better for him. Okay, so that was that game. We got 3 more to go. 3 more to go. Okay, so we'll just look at this one. Fianchetto against Chesick Student. This one kind of ended unfortunately. But still some instructive stuff to look at. Set white name Fianchetto 1, 2, 3. Set black name Chesick Student. Okay, so d4, knight f6, knight f3, g6, bishop f4, bishop g7. So this is funny because white actually plays, or Chesick Student actually plays the same way. Okay, so if you guys remember from the game Neo against Daru Daru, where does this bishop belong? Here, right? Not here. Not here, because this is a carbon copy of what I just showed you, right? Bishop's hitting g6, and then e5, e4 is coming. Bishop's on the right square. So bishop e2 is correct. Fianchetto played bishop d3. Hopefully you guys will learn this eventually. So the better moves are either h3. Again, this is a carbon copy of that other game to give bishop h2. So like on knight h5, you can play bishop h2. Or you can play bishop e2 and be willing to give up the bishop. Okay, but bishop d3 was played. Castle, castle, knight h5, bishop d3, right? So he gets the 2 bishops. c5, c3. Okay, so black played queen b6, which is perfectly fine. Another way to play it is actually just play e5, and then white has to take somehow. If he doesn't take, if he does like d5, f5 is really strong. It's going e4. So he probably has to take. It doesn't really matter which way he takes it. Takes this way. Whoops. Takes this way. Takes this way. And black's already slightly better. He's going to play like queen c7, rook d8, knight c6, etc. But queen b6 is perfectly fine. Okay, so probably here you should play knight b2 as white, because if queen takes b2, knight c4, and this queen actually is almost trapped, believe it or not. The queen is almost trapped. So queen b5, and knight takes d6. And white's actually better now. White's actually better now. And if queen takes c3, there's that little trick, rook c1, queen b4, rook b1, queen c3, rook b3. All of a sudden the queen is actually trapped. So always got to be careful about that one. The pendulum. Got to be careful of the pendulum. So best after knight d2 is actually not to take here, but to play d5 to stop knight c4. And then it's just probably equal. You know, you play like queen c2 or something. Maybe even queen c1. Then just try to get in, you know, take an e4 or something. But instead he played queen e2, trying to defend this pawn, when it didn't really need defending. Like I said, knight b2 kind of indirectly defended it. Bishop g4 was good, knight a3, knight d7, Knight c4, queen c7. With the idea to play like d5 and e5. And then the idea is to play e4. And so here, white should probably kind of anticipate that this is happening and play like knight cd2. And then knight d5, play queen e1, kind of just avoiding all these pins. And then after e5, play take, 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 and take. And okay, black's actually doing quite well. He has a good center, 2 bishops. White's kind of passive. But it's better than what happened in the game, which is bishop e4. Because after bishop e4, so he's trying to stop d5 artificially. But the problem is after e6, this is coming whether you like it or not. So now bishop c2, d5, knight a3, e5. This is crushing for black. e4 is coming. And this pin on this knight is wreaking havoc. So King Ket actually got himself into this same trouble in his other games. He has to watch out for these pins. But black could have kind of just steamrolled here. Instead he played knight f6, bishop d3, and then he played a6. So again, he should probably play like d5 and e5. Although now it's not as strong because this knight is not defending e5 anymore. So he probably has to go like rook e8 first. But don't forget, this knight's pinned always. Okay, he played a6 instead, which is a good idea to kind of play b5. And now a4. So okay, if you play a6, you should play b5. And there's no reason not to play b5 now. This rook is defended. And this is the logical follow-up. The problem is black played this move, rook a b8. But now, this is a big mistake because now a5, and now you can never get in b5. Because now if you play b5 by en passant, and this pawn is remaining on the board. So if you're going to play b5, you got to watch out that a4 actually threatens to stop b5 by playing a5. So you got to kind of play b5 and go for it. So no more preparation. You just got to go for it. And it's actually good for black. But yeah, after rook a b8, or sorry, after a4, rook a b8, he correctly played a5. And now you basically wasted 2 moves. You wasted a6 and you wasted rook b8 for nothing, because now you're not playing b5. So instead, you should probably play d5 and then play rook d8. And again, try to play e5. Okay, but he played knight d7, realizing that his knight belonged on d7 to begin with, not on f6. So you see how everything kind of ends up looking silly. Okay, so now e4 was a mistake. He should play d5, and then after e6, play e4, and then e5, e5. This is actually kind of equal now. It's kind of like a good Benoni for black, but white has this a5 pawn and no real issues. But he played e4 right away. Problem is, it just hangs his pawn. So e4 was the right idea, but it doesn't work tactically because this knight is pinned. So you can just win a pawn. Take, take, and take. Rook f c1. Okay, here I'm not really sure why black didn't play knight c5. This knight is a monster on c5 now, threatening knight to b3. So there's no time for b4, just knight to b3. And this knight has no good discoveries because I can just take on c1. So you have to defend against it somehow. But this knight is well posted on c5 for sure. Play queen d8. A little passive, but okay. Queen d2, bishop g7, knight e3, bishop e6, so white's just up a pawn, or black's just up a pawn. Knight g5, knight c5, knight takes e6. Okay. So this is a big one. How should black recapture? With the knight or with the pawn? Okay, this one is a big difference. Sometimes it doesn't matter all that much. But this one is really significant. And the correct answer is, of course, to take with a pawn. Because you control d5 now. Permanent control over d5. This knight is still on a great square. Don't forget, this knight really wants to be on c5. It attacks b3, it attacks e4, it attacks d3. Whoops, that's not how knights move. Also, it opens up this rook onto f2. So f takes e6 does a lot of wonderful things. A lot of wonderful things. Knight takes e6, though, not so much. Because now this knight can come to d5. This knight probably wants to head to c5 anyway, so you're kind of wasting a tempo. And it actually sets the stage for tremendous collapse. If he played f takes e6, this never would have happened. But knight d5 is played, And now black to make one of the worst moves on the board. Have to watch out that this pawn on e7 is attacked, so you want to make sure you do something about that. So probably knight c5 is best here again. Just hitting d3, hitting b3, and getting ready to play e6 maybe, just to kick this knight. But instead you play rook c8, trying to trade rooks. The problem is this queen is going to be overworked, and after rook takes c8, black can resign, because this queen is actually stuck. I think if queen d7, I believe knight e6 actually wins the queen anyway. It's still stuck, can't go here, can't go here, can't go here. But yeah, of course, if queen takes c8, knight takes e7, just wins.
Check.
And yeah, so black resigned. But yeah, f takes e6 was a stronger move though, for sure. Yeah, f takes e6 was for sure. Okay. So 2 more games. We'll look at Sechin Tylik. This will be kind of quick. Okay. So this was e4, c5. This is a Paulson. e6, knight c3, a6. Okay, bishop e3. Okay. So the 2 main moves here are either queen c7 or knight f6. Bishop e4 is actually a mistake. So the reason why this move is a mistake is because this bishop is kind of in no man's land. And the reasoning is knight takes c6. And now, okay, if you play b takes c6, I play queen d4 with a fork. So bishop f8 is relatively best. And then I just play e5, and this is already good for white. Look at black's army and look at white's army. Big difference. And this pawn being stuck on d7 is a big thing. So, okay, if you don't try that, if you try dc6, say, well, at the very least I have like
check
and check, and this is probably pretty good. Because your dark squares are very weak. Actually, I think I played check first.
Check.
And then I played castle. So this is pretty bad too. So the only other thing you could try here is to play bishop takes c3.
Check.
Knight take. So bc6, queen d6. Again, stopping d5. And if queen e7, queen g3. And if g6, bishop d3. And this is just really good. Look at this. Look at these pawns. Looks like checkers, not chess. Not good when your pawns look like checkers, especially when you have no dark squared bishop. And this bishop is a monster. So this doesn't look good. And if dc6 here, well, then again, queen d8,
check.
d8. Castle
check.
Here, I think, is correct. And then if king e8, bishop e6 is strong. This is really good for white too. So the reason why bishop e4 is bad is because knight takes c6. But a3 was played. And now it's just fine again.
Check.
Take, knight f6, knight c6, bc6. Okay, so here white has actually 3 probably decent moves. One is e5. One is queen d4. And one is bishop d3. Those are all probably pretty good. He played bishop g5 instead. After which black should just play h6. So the point is this bishop has to do something. Okay, if bishop takes f6, queen takes f6 is probably just equal. If bishop e3, well, I'm actually probably not going to take on e4, believe it or not, because queen g4 check is a fork, or sorry, queen g4 is a fork, and then queen a5, queen takes g7. And you can't take on d4, or sorry, you can't take on c3 because I have a fork.
Check.
I have this fork. And so, believe it or not, the best move after queen takes g7 is actually rook h7. So the point is, of course, if you take on h7, I'll take on c3.
Check.
And this is good, because if you go here, I go check.
Check.
And if you go here, I go check.
Check.
Now after king moves here, I go check,
Check.
winning the queen. And if you go here, I go check.
Check.
So, and this is actually just a draw. So, so rather than take the rook, the best is actually play queen here. And white's slightly better. White's slightly better. Okay. But this is all kind of going far afield. So after bishop e3, by the way, the best move is probably just queen c7, and it's just, again, equal. So you play queen c7 to kind of keep a queen out of d6. And now you're maybe ready to play d5. Alright. But instead he played queen a5, try to hit the bishop. So bishop f6, g f6, queen f3, defense and attack, queen e5. So I'm threatening to play f5 here because this pawn is pinned. So bishop e2 was good. And now black needs to take this opportunity to make a prophylactic move. And the move he should play is rook to b8. So it gets his rook on this open file, but it also stops rook b1, which is annoying. And now he can, kind of develop his bishop when he wants to, play c5, get on e4, castle at some point. His king is not terribly unsafe on the king side. There's not much material on the board, so... And black would be fine here. He instead played bishop to b7. But now after rook to b1, he's got some issues. So he should probably play rook to b8, queen e3, c5, f4, queen c7. You can't take on e4, of course, because the bishop is pinned. And then just castle, castle. And white's probably slightly better. More active pieces. But after rook b1, he played castle, which makes things even worse. Makes things even worse. Because now, the problem is he can't really get any pieces over to the queen side. So castle, rook hg8. And here, white should probably just play rook b6 with the idea of hitting this and threatening this. He instead played g3. And now black blunders with rook g7. So black needs to really do something about his queen side. So probably c5 to get his bishop out, rook fe1, king c7 to get his rook out, bishop f1, and rook b8. Just try to get trades on the b file happening. And okay, white's probably a little bit better, but not significant. Problem is after rook g7, his pieces are all of a sudden really uncoordinated. These rooks aren't connected. This rook is in no man's land. I mean, doubling on this file does nothing. This pawn is really strong. And white's attack is just coming crashing through. So rook b6 would have been good. King c7, queen e3, bishop c8, rook b4, king d6, f4, queen a5,
Check.
e5, fe5, fe5.
Check.
You can't play queen e5 because of rook d4 check. And king e7, bishop h5. This is kind of hopeless. This pawn's going to fall. This bishop's terrible. This queen's terrible. I'm going to double on this file, get my queen into d6. It's really bad. He played queen d3 instead, though, which was also good. Setting up some tricks. Queen c7. Okay, so he played this queen takes a6 trick, which is pretty good. But he actually has something even slightly better, which is rook b2. And so rook g5. The point is he wants to play rook b5 and try to offer a trade. But just a4. Rook a5, rook fb1. Bishop a8. And now queen takes a6.
Check.
Queen takes a6. Take,
Check.
take. And this is very good for white. The thing just wins a piece. You have to take. Because if you go like queen e5, this is mate.
Checkmate.
Yeah. So that would have been good. But he played queen takes a6, which is also pretty good. So the trick is if he takes, you take, and then queen b7 is forced. So relatively best here would have been to play queen b8, giving his king a flight square. So he's threatening bishop takes queen now. So queen b6. And now queen a8. Because again, I was threatening bishop a6. And again, you couldn't take because of mate. So queen a8. And now, believe it or not, What's white's best move here? Believe it or not, it's a funny e5. So the point of e5 is just to block the 5th rank. So the point is, if you take on e5, I'm just going to go a4, a5, a6. And there's not a single thing you can do to stop it. You're completely tied down. And if you try after e5, if you try rook g5, I'm just going to play f4. And now you're never getting it through. If rook f5, just play a4. If you take, I play a5. If you take, I just play a6. And this is GG. So e5 is a cute little blocking sacrifice. Because if you play a4 right away, I could play rook g5. And now you can't really play e5. And I'm getting ready to play, like, you know, rook someplace. Getting ready to play rook a5. So if you play f4, I can play rook a5. And all of a sudden I'm surviving. So that would have been cute. But none of this happened. He played rook dg instead. And the rest of the game was pretty accurate. Queen a7 was strong. Threatening rook takes b7 now. Because if queen takes b7, just bishop a6 wins the queen. So he tried sacrificing all his pieces.
Check.
But this doesn't really work.
Check.
King h1 was also possible, by the way. But he played king f2. A little riskier. Queen f4,
Check.
king e1. Queen e3. Okay, and this is just over. Because white's up a rook. Oh, actually he took here, which is even stronger. Sorry. And white's up a rook and a piece. And there's no checks, really. Okay, so white won. Alright, so that was that game. And now one final game between Andrew and Naim. He streamed this game. But I'll just give you guys insight into a couple of things. Because he actually played an opening I play. So it was a Spanish 4 knights. Knight f6, knight c6. Knight f6, d6, d4, e takes, knight takes. Okay, so d6 is kind of a little bit of a passive move, but it's perfectly playable. Actually, the 2 last times I've had this opening in tournaments, both players played d6. And they were both IM, so what do I know? More normal move is, by the way, either bishop b4 or knight d4. But okay, d6 is playable. d4, e4, knight d4, bishop d7, this is all correct. Castle. Okay, so usually here, black just plays bishop e7 with the idea of castling. But knight takes d4 is a little too accommodating for white, because trading these pieces doesn't actually help you as black, because it just puts white's pieces on good squares. This queen is active on d4. So queen takes d4, bishop takes b5, knight takes b5. Okay. So a6. Okay, so white just commonly played knight c3, but actually white had another interesting possibility, which is to play e5 here. Knight c3 is reasonable, but this is actually good too. So the point is that you can't take, obviously. This is just terrible. Queen takes e5.
Check.
Fork. Okay, if you take on b5, I will take on f6. If you take on f6, I'm not going to obviously take, but I'll just play queen e4 check.
Check.
Bishop b7, take on b7, castle, and I'll take on b5. And I'm actually up a pawn here. Black has some compensation, of course, a lot of open lines, but white is up a pawn. Oh, whoops, sorry. let me re-enter the moves. So let me show you the one other line that could have happened in that line, in that variation. Okay. So yeah, e5, and then if c5, it's kind of similar. Queen c3, ab5, ef6, queen f6, and again, you don't want to trade queens, but you play queen d3. And believe it or not, black's best move here is to play queen d8. So that on queen takes b5, you can play queen d7. But, of course, white will play rook e1.
Check.
And then this is good for white, of course. Something like this. Maybe even just queen e4 right away. Yeah, this is probably good for white. Because now I'm also even threatening this. Okay. But in any case, so that was just another possibility. Knight c3 is perfectly fine. Bishop e7. Oops, not king e7. Bishop g5. h6, bishop h4. Okay. So now black just needs to kind of castle, get safe before undertaking any crazy adventures. So for example, castle rook d1, rook e8. And black's position is, you know, kind of passive but very safe, no real weaknesses. White eventually at some point will have to do something drastic to progress, try to play e5 at some point, but you know, trades will help black out. But instead he played c5, and now he's starting to go awry, because now this pawn all of a sudden is a bit more weak, and chasing the queen away doesn't actually do anything constructive. Okay, so b5. Okay, so he's kind of going gung-ho on the queen side. Not terrible. Rook a d1. Okay, but now he goes astray. Again, he has to castle, and it's not so bad. But he plays this move b4. And now white finds some very nice punishment for black not having castled. And the way to start is with e5. So the point is, if you take on c3, I take on here, and this is just really good for white. If you take on f6, I can throw this check and force you to play king f8. And your position is very bad. So d5 was correct. And white actually had two possibilities here. He played queen to g3 with the idea of a double attack on the queen and the rook. Or sorry, the queen and the pawn. But queen f3 was also possible with an attack on a8. So queen c8 is forced. And then bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, knight d5, threatening knight b6, and as well as knight takes f6, so bishop d8 forced. Rook fe1, and now castle and rook takes e5. And it's even material, but white has nice pressure. This bishop is kind of stuck. It can't go this way because of knight e7, can't go this way because of knight b6. You can double on the e file. So this would have been another way to play it. Queen g3 was also quite strong though. And now black had only one move really, queen to b6. You'll see why this is important in a second, as opposed to what he played. But queen takes g7, rook g8, knight d5, believe it or not. Rook takes g7, knight takes b6, rook d8, rook d8,
check.
King d8, rook
check.
d1. And now you have to go king e8, because if king c7, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, knight d5
check.
wins a piece. So you have to go king e8 in this position. And then h3. And what's the material? It's even, but all of black's pieces are misplaced, all of white's pieces are good. So white will probably win at least a pawn eventually. At some point. But this is kind of what black has to go for. So black played queen c7, not seeing there's much of a difference. But the difference is after, again, queen takes g7, rook g8. This move knight d5 is super strong because it attacks this knight and it attacks this queen. So if knight takes knight, queen takes rook, this wins all the pieces. You win this piece, you win this piece. And if you take the queen, the problem is I play knight takes queen check. So this comes with check. So that's why queen b6 was better, because knight takes queen wasn't with check. But now since it's with check, I just win a full rook here. There's really nothing else to do. I mean, if the queen moves somewhere, just knight takes f6 is devastating.
Check.
I mean, this just wins everything. I
check.
Take here, I take here. I take here.
Check.
I take here.
Check.
It's just checkers, taking everything. Okay, so relatively best here for black is actually to castle. Castling is legal. Castling is legal. And now white has to find something accurate to remain up a rook. So if white takes the queen, for example, this is probably the weakest of the moves. I take the queen, I have to. Take, and this is just slightly better for white. It's just, you know, you have a good knight versus bad bishop. That's about it. You know, maybe you can win a pawn. I'm not even so sure you should take that, though. So that's the weakest of the moves. Slightly stronger would be to play knight takes e7.
Check.
And then after queen takes e7, bishop takes f6, rook takes g7, bishop takes e7. And white's just up a piece here. That's the strongest way to play. The second strongest way to play is to take on g8, after which point you remain up in exchange. Knight takes g8, knight takes c7, and my knight defends e7, so I can just take on c7. You take on d8, I take on d8, rook d1,
check.
c7. Okay. So in this position, white's up to exchange. I mean, it's pretty easy win too. But after castle, white would have to find knight takes e7.
Check.
Or sorry, not here. Here. White would have to find
check.
Knight takes e7 here to remain up a piece. But in the game, he played queen b7, and now everything just falls.
Check. Check.
King e7. Okay, and just one cute final little point. Not that it's really important because you're up so much material here, but do you guys see the best move here for white? It's actually a mate in 12. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, it's a mate in 12. Do you guys see the mate in 12? Since it's the last game, I'll give you guys 30 seconds to see the mate in 12. It's just kind of cute, the pattern. Again, it's not really super important. But the mate in 12 starts with queen to g7. So obviously his bishop is pinned. And the point is, if take, there's actually a cute mate with check,
check, check,
and mate.
Checkmate.
So the little pendulum swing. And notice the king can't go any worse. So you guys want to see the full mate in 12 in all its glory, I will show it to you. Queen b6 defending the bishop. b1. Take. Check. Okay, so this is forced. Take.
Check.
Take.
Check.
Take. Oops. Check.
Check.
Take. So he's trying to run. Stopping him. Now threatening mate. Rook e4 is mate. Gotta stop that. Check.
Check.
Rook d4. And now another cute move. Queen d7. So obviously rook takes queen is illegal. And if rook takes rook, this is mate.
Checkmate.
So you're kind of in a bit of a zugzwang. So relatively best is to play b3. But then check.
Check. Checkmate.
So there's mate in 12 for you. And that will be it for the week 3 ladder recap. Hope you guys enjoyed. Play some good games in the ladder, and we'll see you next week.